The reception was already full when Alice arrived. The blue dress she'd carefully chosen fitted tightly around her shoulders. Her hair tied back the way Robert always said made her feel more confident. She picked up her badge at the registration desk without suspecting anything, smiled at the photographer, and only then read the words in black letters. "The old lady who'll pay for everything." Her face didn't heat up immediately. First, there was a brief emptiness, as if someone had muted the sound. Then the noise returned all at once. Glasses clinking, laughter, music. Alice took a deep breath and looked around, trying to figure out if it was a bad joke or a printing error. At the groomsmen's table, Pamela watched her out of the corner of her eye, waiting for her reaction with a smile that mixed disdain and expectation. Richard pretended not to see, but his tense shoulder betrayed his knowledge, accepted it, and chose not to intervene. Jennifer, busy with greetings, didn't notice. Right away, Alice felt as if something old, stored away for years, had just broken. She didn't make a scene. She handed her badge to the lady at the check-in desk, politely asked for another with the correct name, and headed to the reserved table, measuring each step so as not to allow herself to falter. Inside, she silently revisited every bank transfer, every credit card approval, every renovation she'd paid for without argument. She remembered the trip to Cancun she'd paid for as a couple's anniversary gift, the grandchildren's bilingual school, the new car that had come about out of necessity. The word old didn't hurt on its own. It hurt because it was attached to the idea that its only value was opening her wallet. It hurt because it was public, because it was printed, because it had been planned. She thought of Robert and his patience when his son's protege became a demand, and his expression when he'd said, "You decide, Al. Your money, your peace." Peace had a limit, she realized, and someone had crossed it. Martin Reynolds discreetly stopped beside her with a simple greeting, as if arriving to inquire about the weather. He didn't ask about her name tag. Having seen and read the entire scene, he thought she deserved a few minutes to decide how to react. Alice thanked him for coming, his hand firmly on the back of her chair, and then he mentioned, in a low voice, that he'd been carrying a sealed envelope with him since Robert's wake. It was the codicil they'd discussed in secret, precisely for a situation where her dignity would be publicly and maliciously tested. Martin wasn't there to incite a fight, but to reassure her that she wasn't unarmed. Alice listened without taking her eyes off the dance floor, where Jennifer was absently practicing her steps. She didn't want to ruin her granddaughter's wedding, even with the humiliation still fresh. She decided to keep the information to herself and observe. Pamela loitered around like she owned the place, collecting greetings and making calculated comments. She said the family was close-knit and generous, mainly thanks to Richard's mother, who is a blessing. Her tone, however, had sharp edges that were only noticeable to those familiar with her habits. Richard always kept his glass full, talking about business and opportunities, repeating that the market is incredible, you can make money work. He liked to see himself as a strategist, even when the strategy depended on his mother's pocketbook. Jennifer, between hugs, avoided conflict without noticing that her grandmother kept her hands clasped together, as if trying not to shake. Michael, the eldest grandson, noticed the mistake on the name tag and felt uncomfortable. He walked over to Alice and asked if everything was okay, and she said yes, but his eyes knew otherwise. The evening continued with speeches and well-served dishes. In one of the toasts, Pamela thanked everyone who made this day possible, and the pause before looking at Alice lasted longer than necessary. The nearby tables laughed at something that wasn't said but suggested. Martin mentally jotted down names, looks, and reactions, knowing that social proof counts too. Alice maintained her composure. She didn't want to turn her granddaughter's party into a courtroom. Her heart begged for silence and remembrance, not scandal. She decided the answer would come in due time, without screams or broken glasses, but with consequences. When the orchestra played Robert's favorite song, Alice felt a pang, and that pang became focus. She finished the evening without crying, which was her first victory of the day. The next morning, the first message on her phone was from Pamela, sending a link to a resort in the Maldives. "I think it looks just like Jennifer, right? Can you book today?" Accompanied by a heart emoji and a champagne emoji. The second was from Richard, reinforcing that it would be a lovely, unforgettable honeymoon gift. There was no good morning, no question about how she was. Alice stared at the screen for a few seconds and remembered how many times she had said yes without thinking. The yes had become automatic, a conditioned reflex. She put her phone away, made coffee, opened the windows, and decided she would respond when she wanted, not when others' urgency dictated. Michael sent a short message. "Grandma, if you want to talk, I'm around." Alice responded with a yes, and it was the only conversation she chose that day. That afternoon, Richard insisted on a video call. He talked about how the family needs to maintain the same standard, as if a standard were a rule of living. He reminded her that her house was too big for just one person, and suggested that selling would be rational, since idle money doesn't help anyone. Pamela appeared in the background, carrying spreadsheets, and said that managing expenses would be more organized if everything went through them. Alice listened without interrupting, wanting to understand how far they would go. She noticed that at no point did they mention her well-being, her routines, her habits, her memories. Everything was about numbers and control. When the call ended, Alice sat in the living room armchair and looked at the unfinished painting on the easel. It had been a while since she had touched her brushes. She decided she would start painting again that very day, as a first gesture of giving herself back time. Michael showed up late in the afternoon with fresh bread and coffee. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't bring a hidden proposal. He spoke of his dream of opening a small bookstore, with events featuring local authors, a book club for seniors and young people, a simple cafe, and wooden tables. It was a long-time dream, kept hidden for fear of appearing naive. Alice listened with genuine attention and sensed a purposeful project. They walked around the neighborhood, pointing out empty properties, imagining bookshelves. Michael didn't pressure her for money. He offered work and a sense of community. For the first time in a long time, Alice found herself considering investing in something that wasn't a facade of status, but rather a living space. She went to sleep with her head full of new possibilities and the feeling that she still had a lot to build, not just pay for. The invitation to the post-wedding brunch arrived formally. Pamela wrote that it would be a moment of gratitude to the event supporters. Alice understood the implied message. She decided to go. She wanted to see, hear, and, if necessary, speak. Martin was notified and agreed to attend discreetly, to witness whatever was necessary. On the morning of the brunch, Alice chose a light, simple dress and a small briefcase where she kept some receipts and Martin's office card. She wasn't planning on confronting him, but she was prepared not to run away from him. Michael offered to pick her up and wait outside if she preferred to leave quietly. Alice thanked him and asked him to come in, not as protection, but as a friendly presence. He agreed and sat at a side table, attentive and silent. The brunch began with greetings and the repetition of empty compliments. At one point, Pamela stood up with a glass and drew attention. She said she wanted to share some wonderful news. Jennifer's honeymoon will be in the Maldives, a loving gift from our dear Alice. There was applause. Jennifer paled in surprise because she hadn't heard about the announcement and hadn't asked for it. Richard nodded, confident his mother would confirm. Alice waited for the applause to die down. She looked at her granddaughter first, then at the guests, then at Pamela. She said calmly that she hadn't promised any trips and that she didn't authorize anyone to speak for her about money. The room fell silent as it had during the badge passing ceremony. But now the silence was different, heavy and attentive. Pamela tried to laugh and said it was just a joke, but her words fell flat. Richard approached and whispered that it could look bad for the family. as if it were Alice's responsibility to say no, not the one who announced it without consent. Alice replied that respect isn't table decoration. It's a condition of coexistence. Martin, keeping his distance, observed the faces and reactions. Jennifer took the floor and apologized to her grandmother for the embarrassment, stating that she hadn't expected that announcement. It was the first crack in Pamela's narrative that morning. Some guests looked away. Others fiddled with their phones to escape the discomfort. Alice didn't elaborate. She simply said that she loved her granddaughter, that her presence there was out of affection, and that gifts, when they exist, are arranged privately. She sat down. The simple yet firm gesture redefined everything. The message was clear. The dynamic of submission was over. After brunch, Richard's messages took on a different tone, a mix of irritation and control. He wrote that his mother was being influenced and had no head for financial decisions. Pamela reinforced that they were trying to help and that the house should be sold as soon as possible. Alice took a deep breath, drank some water, and decided to go into silence mode for a few days. She turned off notifications, arranged with Michael to visit 2 small commercial properties, and set aside 2 mornings to resume painting. Starting with the paintings, she'd stopped painting since before the morning. Martin suggested she write down each episode of Disrespect with date and context to capture the pattern. Alice agreed, not out of revenge, but out of a clear boundary. She knew there was a clear line between loving her family and being exploited by them. From that point on, every step would be taken with her eyes open. In the days that followed, Alice realized how silence bothered her more than any direct response. Pamela sent messages with links to articles on financial management for seniors, trying to disguise what was pure manipulation as care. Richard called and left voicemail messages, complaining that she was missing and that the family needs to communicate. Alice listened but didn't respond. Instead of exhausting conversations, she filled her time with activities she'd neglected. She resumed her habit of walking in the park early in the morning, greeting neighbors she hadn't seen in months. She started frequenting a nearby coffee shop, where the owner always asked about her paintings and offered an extra coffee on the house. The world outside the family pressure seemed more welcoming than she remembered. Michael, noticing his grandmother's renewed enthusiasm, brought a new notebook and suggested she jot down ideas for the bookstore. "It doesn't have to be anything specific, Grandma. Just write down what you'd like to see," he said. Alice started with simple things: comfortable chairs, warm lighting, a small bookshelf dedicated to local authors. Then came ideas for events, reading afternoons for children, and exhibitions by community artists. The notebook, which began with 3 pages, grew in volume within a few days. Michael came by regularly, not to demand anything, but to build together. The atmosphere was light, undemanding, and it reminded Alice that true support doesn't need to be bought. In the improvised studio in the living room, Alice rediscovered the joy of mixing paints. Her first canvases came out timid, as if her hand were rusty. But with each passing day, her confidence returned. One painting in particular, of an open field with a gray sky, caught the attention of a friend who came to visit. "This is you, isn't it?" "Free," her friend said. Alice smiled because she had never thought of it that way. But she recognized that the painting reflected what she was feeling: space to breathe. Afternoons of painting became part of her routine, and she noticed that when she was involved in the creative process, she completely forgot about external pressures. Richard, feeling he was losing ground, changed his strategy. He began sending messages about how he was worried and that his mother was being misunderstood by the family. He insinuated that some relatives might think Alice was distancing herself from everyone, and that this wasn't good for her image. Pamela, for her part, continued inviting Alice to events where she would have to show she was okay. Events, of course, that required financial contributions. Alice, now alert, recognized the pattern. Before, she would have given in to avoid conflict. Now she simply said she couldn't attend. She didn't give long explanations. Freedom also lay in the economy of words. Martin, ever discreet, began organizing the documentation for Robert's codicil. He asked Alice to keep copies safe, away from home, and to record each new attempt at manipulation. He also explained that, legally, a single incident wasn't enough to trigger the codicil. Ongoing disrespectful behavior had to be proven. Alice understood that her patience now had a practical purpose, building a solid case. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was laying the groundwork for a definitive decision. One Saturday, Alice and Michael found a small property downtown with a large storefront and a storage room in the back. It wasn't perfect, but it had potential. The rent was within their budget, and the location was close to schools and cafes. Michael presented a simple plan. Start with used books and gradually expand to new releases and events. Alice, looking at the storefront, envisioned the space bustling with life. She said she would help with the initial investment, but made it clear that she would be a partner, not a sponsor. Michael accepted with a smile and a handshake. It was the first time in years she had invested money in something that would also bring her personal satisfaction. The bookstore's opening was low-key, but meaningful. Friends, neighbors, and a few curious people came in to take a look. Alice worked the checkout alongside Michael, chatting with customers and helping pack books. By the end of the day, sales exceeded expectations. But what stood out most were the compliments about the atmosphere and the service. Pamela and Richard didn't show up. They only sent a short message saying they hoped it wouldn't be another useless expense. Alice read it and ignored it. What was useless to them was giving her new meaning. Gradually, the bookstore became a meeting place. Reading groups formed, local artists exhibited their work, and even children began participating in story times. Alice realized that the space wasn't just a business, but also a community. She felt useful, valued by those who truly recognized her dedication. The contrast with family interactions was stark. At the end of the month, she and Michael did the math and saw that the business was in the black. It was a promising start and, more importantly, independent of any external approval. Richard didn't handle this new reality well. Realizing that his attempts at pressure weren't working, he began spreading among acquaintances that his mother had memory problems and didn't know how to handle money. Pamela reinforced this narrative, saying that it was all for her own good. Alice learned of these conversations through neighbors and mutual acquaintances. Instead of confronting her directly, she kept the information to herself and wrote it down. Every detail became part of the dossier Martin was assembling. It was in this atmosphere that the invitation to a family lunch arrived. Supposedly for reconnection, Alice knew it would be yet another attempt to convince her to sell the house. Still, she accepted, bringing a friend along as a discreet witness. During lunch, between dishes and toasts, Richard pulled out a folder and began explaining that it would be safer if she signed a document, granting him power of attorney to manage her finances. Pamela, standing next to him, nodded, as if it were the logical solution. Alice listened in silence until he finished. Martin, who was standing a few feet away, stood and approached. He took a copy of the codicil from his pocket and placed it on the table. He explained clearly that any attempt to control Alice's assets against her will, or to publicly disrespect her, would result in automatic exclusion from the inheritance. The room fell, silent immediately. Richard tried to argue that this was radical, but Martin read the relevant passages aloud, making it clear that Robert had already anticipated the decision years before. Pamela, pale, said nothing. Alice, in a firm voice, declared that she was enforcing the codicil. The decision was official that same week. Richard and Pamela were formally removed from the inheritance, and their share was redistributed to Michael in recognition of their respect and support. Alice didn't make a public fuss, but word spread quickly among acquaintances and family. For the first time in a long time, she slept without the burden of constant defensiveness. It wasn't just about money. It was about regaining control of her own life. Michael, moved, promised to honor the trust and care not only for the business, but also for the relationship they had built. In the days following her decision, Alice felt a relief unlike any she had ever experienced. It wasn't the euphoria of a momentary victory, but the solid calm of knowing she would no longer be held hostage by manipulation. For the first time in years, she could wake up without worrying about messages demanding immediate responses or phone calls filled with demands. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. She began to reorganize each room, removing objects that no longer held meaning and keeping only what brought back good memories. This physical cleansing seemed to accompany the emotional cleansing that was happening inside. Michael became a constant presence, but never invasive. He'd stop by for coffee, tell her about the bookstore's news, or simply sit with her on the porch and watch the street scene. Alice realized that, with him, there were no power plays, just genuine companionship. He updated her on the store's activities, new reading groups, sales that exceeded expectations, and even customers who asked about her. Hearing these stories reinforced the feeling that she had invested not just in a business, but in something that kept her connected to life in a healthy way. Meanwhile, Richard and Pamela maintained their distance. Their contact was limited to formal messages on special occasions, lacking the previously intimate tone. Alice wasn't seeking forced closeness. She knew that, for them, the separation was a consequence of the loss of financial control. Still, she harbored no open resentment. She understood that everyone lives according to their own choices, and that she had finally learned to protect hers. Interestingly, her relationship with Jennifer began to slowly mend. Her granddaughter began visiting her alone, without the burden of her parents' presence, and these conversations brought an unexpected freshness. Alice also allowed herself to rediscover simple pleasures. She returned to a Saturday painting group, where she met people who valued her art. She accepted invitations for short trips with friends, something she had avoided for years for fear of needing to be available for her family. With each new experience, she felt more confident in saying yes or no, based on what she wanted, not what others expected. This autonomy was a daily learning process, but each small decision reinforced that she was on the right path. At the bookstore, Alice became more actively involved. She began curating some books, helping choose titles that would appeal to different audiences. She also helped organize events, such as book signings and themed gatherings. Seeing the space full and vibrant reminded her of how, in the past, her money financed lavish events that brought her no emotional return. Now, every penny invested had meaning and created something real. The local community embraced the bookstore as a landmark. Teachers brought students on visits. Budding writers found a space to showcase their work. And even musicians began performing at small gatherings organized there. Alice felt proud to be part of something that benefited so many. And most importantly, she knew it all existed because she had decided to say enough at the right time. Alice's next birthday was completely different from the previous one. Michael and close friends organized a simple but affectionate celebration. Instead of expensive gifts or calculated gestures, she received handwritten letters, restored old photos, and even a painting by a friend from her art group. There were no offensive name tags, no ulterior motives. There was just laughter, conversation, and music chosen by her. Alice realized she didn't need pomp to feel appreciated. Even so, there were times when memories of the past surfaced. She recalled the countless times she'd withdrawn to avoid conflict, the sleepless nights due to pressure, and the arguments disguised as family conversations. But now these memories served as a reminder of how much had changed. Instead of weighing her down, they served as fuel to maintain her new posture. Jennifer, during one of the 4 visits, confessed that she had been embarrassed by the badge incident and that, At the time, she didn't know how to react. Alice listened without interrupting. Her granddaughter explained that she was trying to distance herself from her parents' manipulation and learn to make decisions on her own. That conversation was one of the most frank they had ever had, and Alice felt that, in some way, her courage was serving as an example for the next generation. Over time, Alice began to see herself less as a victim and more as the protagonist of her own story. She understood that, although she couldn't change other people's behavior, she had complete control over her own choices. This freed her from a cycle of guilt and obligation that had trapped her for years. Her life now had more room for genuine relationships, fulfilling projects, and the peace of mind of knowing she could live well without depending on anyone's approval. Martin, ever attentive, continued to follow closely, but now, more as a friend than as a lawyer. He admired the way Alice had handled everything without public outbursts, but with firmness and strategy. Many people would have caved to the pressure or gotten into exhausting arguments. She, on the other hand, had chosen patience as her tool, and it had worked. In conversation, he commented that Robert would be proud, and Alice smiled, imagining that, somehow, he really would be. A year later, looking back, Alice saw a journey full of small victories that, together, formed a profound change. The woman who was once called the old lady who pays for everything was now remembered as the woman who built a new life at 65. Her story spread throughout the neighborhood, inspiring others to set boundaries and value their own well-being. And, at the center of it all, was the certainty that respect and true love can't be bought. They are earned and cultivated day after day. With the success of the bookstore and a more relaxed life, Alice began to get involved in community activities. She accepted an invitation to join the board of a neighborhood cultural center, where she helped organize events and fundraisers for social projects. She discovered she had a natural talent for connecting people and articulating ideas, something she had never explored before. Being surrounded by people with positive energy reinforced her decision to distance herself from toxic relationships. Gradually, her social circle expanded, bringing new friendships and opportunities. Michael, motivated by the bookstore's growth, proposed creating a small cafe within the space. The idea was to offer a cozy place for customers to linger and participate in events. Alice immediately supported the effort, not only with investment but also with practical ideas, simple recipes, intimate decor, and even a selection of background music. The project was a success and soon became an added attraction, increasing traffic and revenue. Alice enjoyed watching groups of young people mingling with older men and women for afternoons of reading and coffee. Despite the distance between Richard and Pamela, attempts at contact occasionally emerged. Some messages were loaded with indirect messages, others more neutral, as if nothing had happened. Alice responded only when she felt it was necessary, maintaining a polite but firm tone. There was no longer room for emotional blackmail or vague promises. She had learned to differentiate genuine affection from convenience, and this clarity guided all her interactions. One day, Pamela showed up unexpectedly at the bookstore. She came alone, with a practiced smile, saying she missed family together. Alice welcomed her warmly, but without intimacy. The conversation was brief and revolved around trivialities, until Pamela subtly tried to mention investments that could be made together. Alice closed the conversation by saying she was happy with her life as it was. Pamela realized there was no opening and left, promising to come back for coffee sometime. Alice knew the visit was more about curiosity about her life than reconciliation. The relationship with Jennifer, on the other hand, continued to strengthen. Her granddaughter began helping with some of the bookstore's events and even suggested new meeting formats to attract more young people. These collaborations brought the two even closer, creating memories that didn't depend on expensive gifts or family obligations. Alice felt she was building a genuine bond with Jennifer, based on mutual respect and shared interests. One Sunday afternoon, Alice received an unexpected letter from an old friend with whom she had lost touch years ago. The friend told her she had read about the bookstore in a local newspaper and that it had inspired her to reopen her sewing studio. This external recognition moved Alice, who realized how her story was already impacting other lives without her even realizing it. The reply came quickly, marked by an invitation to meet again and rekindle their friendship. With her life more stable, Alice began planning trips. Not luxurious trips to show off, but itineraries she'd always wanted to take but never prioritized. Her first destination was a small, historic town known for its craft fairs and music festivals. She returned with a suitcase full of rare books for the bookstore, handmade items for the cafe, and stories to tell. The trip not only brought new experiences, but also reinforced the feeling that it was possible to enjoy life on one's own terms. Upon her return, she found the bookstore even busier. Michael had organized a special event featuring local authors, and it was such a success that it began being replicated monthly. Alice realized that the business was becoming self-sustaining, a direct reflection of the dedication of everyone involved. This gave her the peace of mind to plan new projects without the constant pressure of maintaining everything herself. One morning, while tidying up some drawers, Alice found an old photo album filled with memories with Robert and their young children. The images brought a mixture of longing and gratitude. She thought about how easy it would have been to let life slip through her fingers after his death, giving in completely to the emotional and financial dependence his family imposed. But there she was, rebuilt, in control of herself, proving that it's never too late to start over. The experience with the codicil and the breakup with Richard and Pamela also taught her about planning and protection. She began talking to Martin about adjusting her own will and formalizing donations to causes she believed in. She wanted to ensure that her legacy would be used responsibly and that no one could distort her intentions in the future. This concern for the future was another expression of the freedom she had gained. Little by little, Alice noticed that people began seeking her out, not only for her bookstore, but also for advice. Widows, retirees, young entrepreneurs. Everyone wanted to hear how she had managed to turn her life around without losing her dignity. She never presented herself as a perfect example, but rather shared what she had learned. The importance of knowing how to say no, of valuing genuine relationships, and of not being afraid to change course, even when it seems too late. At an end-of-year event at the bookstore, Alice gave a brief speech. She thanked everyone who had participated in her journey and emphasized that more than books sold or coffee served, what they had built together was a community. The applause she received wasn't a formality, but a recognition. Looking around, seeing smiling faces and friends who had become an essential part of her life, she understood that her story had become something much bigger than she imagined when she decided to give her first firm no. The start of the new year brought confirmation that Alice had found her balance. The bookstore remained. Thriving, the cafe inside had become a beloved meeting place, and her social life was more active than ever. She woke early by choice, not obligation, and started the day with a walk to the square, greeting acquaintances along the way. Routine was now her ally, not a burden. Each day felt like an opportunity to create something meaningful, not to put out family fires. Even in this scenario, Richard tried one last push. He called to say he was willing to talk, and that maybe they had overdone it in the past. The conversation began conciliatorily, but soon returned to the old pattern, requests disguised as concern. He suggested his mother invest in one of his projects, assuring her that this time it would be different. Alice, unfazed, replied that she was happy with the investments she already had and preferred to keep things as they were. There was no argument, just a heavy silence on the other end of the line before he ended the call. Pamela, for her part, tried a roundabout approach, messaging Jennifer and Michael, saying she wanted to reconnect with Alice. They both warned her and asked if she wanted to respond. Alice thanked them, but said she didn't feel the need. For her, reconciliation only made sense if it was accompanied by genuine change. And that wasn't what was happening. Choosing not to reopen certain doors was, for her, as important as opening new ones. However, Alice didn't want her life to be limited to staying away from conflict. Therefore, she immersed herself even more in the bookstore's projects and community activities. She organized a book donation drive for public schools, involving customers, neighbors, and local authors. The result exceeded all expectations, with hundreds of copies collected. Personally delivering some of these books to children who rarely had access to quality material was one of the most moving moments of the year. With renewed confidence, Alice also began giving short talks in community groups about personal, finance, and autonomy in adulthood. She didn't use technical language, but shared her own experience, explaining how she learned to identify manipulation and set boundaries. These conversations not only helped others, but also reinforced to her that her decisions had been correct. The relationship with Jennifer blossomed. Inspired by her grandmother's approach, her granddaughter began to make more independent decisions, including in her marriage. She told Alice how she was learning to balance her marriage with her own goals without sacrificing herself. Alice listened with pride and discreetly saw herself reflected in this new, more confident and assertive version of Jennifer. Michael, in turn, expanded the bookstore's reach digitally, creating a website and promoting online events. Alice got involved in the process, helping select books for sale and participating in live streams. She had never imagined interacting with people online, but discovered she enjoyed the exchange, especially when readers from other cities praised the work they were doing. One autumn morning, Alice received a visit from Martin, who brought news that all the legal formalities involving the codicil and the redistribution of the inheritance had been finalized. He commented that, thanks to the way everything had been handled, it was unlikely anyone would be able to challenge it in the future. Alice felt a definite sense of relief, as if a door had closed forever. The most painful chapter of this story was over. With this confidence, she decided to do something she'd been putting off for years. A long trip to Italy, a destination she'd always dreamed of visiting with Robert, but which never happened. When she told Michael and Jennifer, she received immediate support and help with planning. She wanted to visit small towns, museums, and art fairs, as well as spend a few days just walking around without a plan. For the first time in a long time, she felt free to make plans without worrying about the consequences for others. The farewell before the trip was warm. Friends from the bookstore and the painting group organized a surprise breakfast to wish her well. Michael promised to send photos of the bookstore while he was away, and Jennifer said she would take care of watering the plants. Alice boarded the plane with a feeling of lightness she hadn't remembered feeling since her youth. It was as if she were opening a new page in her life. During the trip, Alice allowed herself to experience everything: different foods, conversations with strangers, visits to places she'd only seen in books. She spent entire afternoons leisurely observing the landscapes. She bought watercolors from a small shop and painted scenes that moved her. By recording each moment, she realized she was living not just the dream of visiting Italy, but the concrete result of having regained control of her own life. When she returned, she was greeted with hugs and stories about everything that had happened at the bookstore while she was away. She found the space even busier, with new shelves and a wall full of event photos. Alice smiled when she realized that even without her physical presence, the business continued to thrive. This autonomy was proof that she no longer carried the burden of supporting everything alone. Not in the bookstore, not in her life. Over time, the bookstore established itself as a cultural hub in the city. Alice and Michael began receiving invitations to participate in book fairs and events in other municipalities. This not only increased the business's visibility, but also reinforced the bookstore's role as a hub for meetings and the exchange of ideas. Alice felt proud to see that outsiders came, especially to explore the space, take photos, and participate in the activities. It was living proof that projects with a true purpose find their audience. Inspired by the impact they were making, Alice suggested creating a reader sponsorship program where customers could donate money so that children and teenagers could receive free books. The idea was enthusiastically received, and within a few weeks, dozens of sponsors had signed up. Seeing children leaving the bookstore with a book in their hands and a smile on their face was more rewarding to her than any expensive gift she had ever given in the past. The relationship with Jennifer remained strong. Her granddaughter participated in events and even began leading creative writing, workshops for young people. This involvement helped bring the two even closer, creating a bond that didn't depend on Richard and Pamela's presence. Jennifer said she admired her grandmother's courage, and that her attitude gave her the strength to follow her own path, even when it didn't please everyone. Richard, however, didn't fully accept the separation. One day, he showed up at the bookstore door unannounced. He was more reserved than usual, and the conversation began with trivialities. Then, he tried to return to the topic of reconciliation and said they might be able to work things out if she considered helping him with an investment. Alice didn't flinch. She said she preferred to keep their relationship personal without mixing finances. He insisted, and she reiterated clearly that this part of her life was resolved and there was no going back. Richard got the message and left without promising to return. Pamela no longer appeared in person, but from time to time she sent long messages, alternating between attempted justifications and veiled accusations. Alice read them but didn't respond. She realized that by not playing along, the impact of her words lost its power. There was no longer room for guilt for protecting what was hers. With less time spent on family worries, Alice began investing more in herself. She resumed taking Italian lessons, inspired by her trip, and also began teaching basic painting classes at a community center. The joy of teaching and seeing others discover new skills energized her. She increasingly saw herself as someone who could inspire and help, but without sacrificing herself in the process. A special invitation arrived as a surprise. The City Hall wanted to honor the bookstore and its founders for their contribution to local culture. Alice was moved, not by the title itself, but by the public recognition of something that had emerged from a moment of pain, transformed into positive action. Michael had prepared a speech for the event, but insisted that his grandmother join him on stage to receive the honor. On the day of the ceremony, the auditorium was packed. Friends, clients, authors, and neighbors were in attendance. When Alice's name was announced, the applause was slow to subside. She walked firmly onto the stage, holding Michael's hand. Upon receiving the plaque, she spoke a few words, but they were rich in meaning. "I've learned that respect is worth more than any inheritance, and that when we decide to live according to our values, everything changes." After the event, many people came to congratulate her. Some moved to say that her story had inspired change in their own lives. Among those present was Jennifer, who hugged her tightly and said, "Grandma, I want to be just like you when I grow up." This touched Alice in a way no official tribute could. It was proof that her example was leaving a real mark. Richard and Pamela didn't show up, but they heard about the event through social media. There were no congratulatory messages, and Alice hadn't expected any. Their silence no longer weighed on her. What mattered was the sound of voices celebrating her work and her transformation. In the following days, the bookstore's activity increased even more. People who had never been inside before came to explore the space, drawn by the news report about the tribute. Alice took the opportunity to chat with each customer, reinforcing that the bookstore was a space open to everyone. The energy of that moment seemed to permeate the atmosphere. In a relaxed conversation with Martin, Alice commented that she never imagined life after 65 could be so full of new beginnings. He replied that what changed wasn't age, but her choice to no longer accept the role they wanted to impose on her. Alice agreed. She felt like she was in control of her own destiny, surrounded by people who truly valued her, and projects that gave meaning to her daily life. And for the first time in a long time, there wasn't a single part of her life she wanted to change. With the tribute still fresh in her mind, Alice decided she wanted to expand the bookstore's cultural activities. She brought Michael and Jennifer together to discuss ideas, and together they created a regular calendar of events: book clubs, book signings, poetry readings, and exhibitions by local artists. Each activity aimed to bring the community together and showcase talent that often goes unrecognized. Alice felt that, beyond selling books, they were cultivating stories and human connections. One of these events brought an unexpected opportunity. A small publisher specializing in independent authors took an interest in the space and proposed a partnership. The idea was to use the bookstore as a launch pad for new writers in the region. Alice and Michael accepted, and soon the space began hosting book launches that attracted audiences from other cities. This not only increased traffic, but also put the bookstore on the cultural map more broadly. During this period, Alice began to be invited to speak on local radio and small TV shows. Whenever asked about her journey, she avoided revealing painful details of her relationship with Richard and Pamela, preferring to focus on the positive message of independence and respect. She realized that many people saw themselves in her story, and that for some, hearing that it was possible to start over after 60 was the encouragement they needed. The increased visibility also brought new challenges. The bookstore needed more space to accommodate larger events, and the cafe could no longer accommodate all its customers. Michael suggested looking for a property next door and expanding. Alice supported the idea but insisted that the growth should maintain the business's original spirit, proximity, and warmth, without losing the community essence. With careful planning, they managed to rent the neighboring space and integrate the two areas. Meanwhile, Alice's personal life remained peaceful. She maintained her routine of hiking, painting, and meeting friends, never sacrificing time for herself. Her trip to Italy had awakened a desire to explore the world further, and she began planning other destinations, always prioritizing experiences that would bring her learning and pleasure, rather than just superficial tourism. Jennifer, growing closer, surprised her grandmother by announcing that she wanted to open a small digital publishing house geared toward emerging authors. She said the idea grew from her time at the bookstore and her desire to help people realize their dream of publishing. Alice was moved to realize how her change in attitude was inspiring not only her granddaughter, but also her entire network. Richard and Pamela, despite being absent from Alice's life, still shared some social circles. Occasionally, she would hear comments that they spoke little or nothing about the breakup. To Alice, this was irrelevant. What mattered was that the estrangement had been maintained and that her life was thriving independently of them. The peace, she felt, was worth more than any attempt at a forced reconciliation. One afternoon, a group of women from the neighborhood asked Alice to give a talk on managing personal finances after retirement. She accepted and prepared the meeting in a practical way, using real-life examples of how to protect yourself from financial abuse, recognize signs of manipulation, and invest in projects that bring emotional, not just monetary, returns. The talk was so well received that she began to be requested in other neighborhoods. Alice realized that these talks were a powerful form of social impact. It wasn't about imposing her choices as a model, but about showing that it was possible to regain control even after years of emotional or financial dependence. Many of the people who listened to her left, determined to set boundaries and rethink their relationships. This motivated her to continue. At the bookstore, customer traffic was increasing, and the partnership with the publisher was bearing fruit. Authors who had launched their books there were returning for new events, strengthening their relationship with the space. Alice saw this as a healthy cycle. Their success was also the success of the bookstore and the surrounding community. A defining moment occurred when an emotional woman approached Alice after an event and said, "I was ready to sell my house because of pressure from my children. But after hearing your story, I decided to wait and think it over. I think I've regained my courage." Alice was touched. It was living proof that sharing experiences can change destinies. As the months passed, Alice realized that her name was already associated with something positive in the city. Wherever she went, she was greeted with affection and respect. The mean nickname that had once been used to humiliate her had completely lost its weight, replaced by an image of strength, independence, and inspiration. For her, this was the most symbolic victory of all. With the bookstore established and her lectures gaining traction, Alice began receiving invitations to larger events, including regional gatherings on entrepreneurship in later life. She accepted some, but was careful not to overload her schedule. Her priority was still to live peacefully and enjoy every moment, not to turn everything into work. These events also became an opportunity to learn new stories and connect with people from different fields. At one of these meetings, she met Helena, a former literature teacher who was creating a community library project in underserved areas. The idea of bringing books and cultural activities to places without access to these resources captivated Alice, who offered to help. The partnership quickly solidified. The bookstore began collecting donations and providing part of its inventory to supply these libraries. For Alice, it was a way to further expand the positive impact of her work. Jennifer actively participated in this initiative, organizing fundraising events and drives. Michael, in turn, handled the logistics, ensuring the books reached their destinations. The effort involved customers, neighbors, and even partner authors. The project grew to the point of gaining visibility in the local press, reinforcing the bookstore's role as an agent of social transformation. Meanwhile, Alice's personal life continued to flourish. She maintained her painting and reading habits, but now with a new goal: to organize a small exhibition of her work in her own bookstore. Michael insisted that customers would love to see this artistic side of her. At first, Alice hesitated, thinking she wasn't professional enough, but eventually accepted. The simple and welcoming exhibition was a success and sold several pieces. Meanwhile, Richard and Pamela tried once again to reach out, this time inviting them to a family lunch. Alice thought for a few days before responding. She decided to decline, but politely and definitively, making it clear that she preferred to maintain her distance and preserve the peace she had achieved. This was the first time she had said no without feeling a weight on her chest, and this lightness confirmed that her decision was well developed. A few weeks later, she received news that Richard was experiencing financial difficulties. Friends mentioned that he had made risky investments that had failed. Alice listened, but she didn't feel the same old urge to help solve the problem. She understood that everyone was responsible for their own choices, just as she was for hers. This realization brought a sense of profound liberation. The following birthday celebration was even more special. Friends, clients, and family who truly cared gathered at the bookstore for a party filled with music, home-cooked food, and good stories. Jennifer gave an emotional speech, saying that her grandmother had not only changed her own life, but also inspired everyone around her to seek more respect and autonomy. Alice was moved, feeling that all the hard work and difficult decisions had been worth it. Martin was also present, and in a more private moment, commented that it was admirable how she had turned a humiliating episode into such a powerful turning point. He said he'd rarely seen anyone implement a plan with such patience and effectiveness without losing their way. Alice responded that the key was to stop trying to change others and focus on what she could control. With the new year approaching, Alice began planning a scholarship program for young writers. The idea was to fund courses and mentorships for those who wanted to pursue literary careers, using part of the bookstore's profits and with the support of partners. For her, investing in other people's futures was the best way to give back to the community for all she had received. Jennifer and Michael embraced the idea enthusiastically and began to structure the project. They gathered contacts, developed criteria, and even found a creative writing teacher willing to collaborate. Alice was involved at every stage, but made it clear that the young people should take the lead. She wanted to be a facilitator, not a controller. The program's official launch took place at an event at the bookstore, attended by writers, teachers, and local authorities. Alice spoke briefly about the importance of believing in yourself and seeking opportunities, even when everything seems to point to the contrary. The audience responded with warm applause, and she realized that this initiative could change not only the lives of some young people, but also inspire similar actions. That night, as she closed the bookstore, Alice spent a few minutes alone, looking at the shelves and the quiet cafe. She reflected on how everything had changed since Jennifer's wedding day. From the public humiliation to the present moment, there was a long road full of difficult decisions, but also full of achievements. She understood that true closure wasn't in pushing Richard and Pamela away, but in building a life so full that their presence or absence no longer had the power to define anything. With the scholarship program already underway, Alice began receiving letters and messages from young beneficiaries. Many said that without this opportunity, they would never have had the courage or resources to invest in their writing. Some sent texts, poems, and even book drafts, asking for her opinion. Alice read each one carefully, responding with words of encouragement and constructive suggestions. Seeing the direct impact of her initiative reinforced her conviction that she was on the right path. Michael and Jennifer, now official partners in managing the bookstore and the scholarship program, brought new ideas to keep the space active. They organized meetings between scholarship recipients and renowned authors, creating an environment of exchange and learning. Alice participated as a special guest, but always let the young people take center stage. Her pride didn't need the spotlight. Alice's social life was also richer. In addition to the bookstore's events, she began attending art exhibitions, concerts, and short cultural trips with friends. Each new experience seemed to open a window to something she hadn't explored before, as if she were making up for all the years she'd lived to meet others' expectations. During one of these trips, she met a group of women entrepreneurs working in sustainable tourism. The conversation sparked the idea of organizing literary trips with the bookstore, itineraries in which participants would visit cities and locations inspired by famous books. Back home, Alice presented the project to Michael and Jennifer, who immediately embraced the idea. The first itinerary took a group to a historic city famous for its literary fairs. The experience was a success. In addition to exploring the local culture, participants had exclusive meetings with authors and participated in writing workshops. Alice realized that these trips combined two things she loved: literature and new experiences, and also strengthened the community of readers she had created. As new projects emerged, Alice maintained the discipline of setting aside time for herself. She continued painting, tending to her garden, and spending afternoons on the porch, simply watching the street scene. This combination of activity and rest was, for her, the secret to maintaining the balance she had worked so hard to achieve. One day, she received an invitation to tell her story at a major national event on female entrepreneurship. At first, she considered declining. She didn't see herself as someone seeking that kind of exposure. But Michael and Jennifer insisted that her story could inspire thousands of people. She accepted on the condition that she speak with complete sincerity, without embellishment. On the day of the event, The auditorium was packed. Alice took the stage and began her speech simply, recounting everything from the humiliating episode at her wedding to the creation of the bookstore and its impact on the community. She spared no detail about the challenges, but emphasized how each conscious decision she made had changed the course of her life. When she finished, she received a standing ovation. Some people cried, others took photos and asked to talk later. The impact was immediate. Her story gained traction on news portals and social media, attracting even more visitors to the bookstore. More importantly, she began receiving reports from people who, inspired by her words, had taken concrete steps to change their lives, from starting a small business to breaking away from abusive relationships. Despite the new recognition, Alice maintained her usual demeanor, feet on the ground and focused on what really mattered. She continued managing the bookstore, participating in events, and pursuing her social projects. She didn't let success distract her from the simplicity she had chosen to live. Jennifer, over a quiet dinner, said to her grandmother, "You showed me that we can be strong without losing our sweetness. I want to live like that too." Alice smiled, feeling that this was the greatest legacy she could leave. Not just material achievements or projects, but values that would inspire future generations. One night, as she closed the bookstore after a packed event, Alice found herself alone in the space. She walked among the shelves, lightly touching the books, remembering each step of her journey, from the offensive badge to the public tribute, from losses to gains, from a stifled life to full freedom. She smiled, not because she felt the story was over, but because she knew that from then on she would write each new chapter with her own hands, and with the certainty that she was not only a survivor, but the author of her own life. The following months cemented Alice's life at a level of stability and purpose she had never imagined reaching. Everything seemed well balanced. The bookstore, the literary trips, the scholarship program, and the strengthened bonds with people who truly mattered. The past still existed, but it didn't weigh her down. It was like a book she had already read in its entirety. A few painful pages, but they had led her this far. One day, opening her mailbox, Alice found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo of her with Richard and Pamela, taken many years earlier along with a short note. "I'm sorry." There was no signature, but the handwriting was Richard's. She held the photo for a few moments, reflecting on the weight and value of a belated apology. She decided to keep it, not as an invitation to reconciliation, but as a sign that, somehow, her message had been understood. This gesture, however small, brought Alice a quiet peace. She didn't need Richard to return, or Pamela to change. Completely. Her life was already complete without them. But recognizing that she had left a mark, even on those who had once hurt her, reinforced the power of her choices. Around the same time, Michael announced that the bookstore had achieved record sales the previous month. The cafe was always full, and the events calendar needed to be adjusted to accommodate demand. Alice, upon hearing this, felt a deep sense of pride, not only because of the financial results, but because it was the result of collaborative work, mutual respect, and a purpose that went far beyond profit. She then decided to do something special. She secretly planned an international trip with Michael and Jennifer as a way of saying thank you. She chose a literary destination where they could explore historic bookstores, museums, and fairs. When she revealed the surprise, she was greeted with hugs and tears of joy. For her, giving back in this way was a privilege. While organizing the trip, Alice received news that the scholarship program had been expanded thanks to donations from local businesses. More young people would have the chance to develop their talents, and it reminded her of how small opportunities can change entire destinies. She felt like she was, in fact, building something that would continue even after she was no longer around. On the day of departure, already at the airport, Alice watched Michael and Jennifer chatting animatedly. She reflected on how much their relationship with her had transformed, and how that bond was now based on choices rather than obligations. This difference was the foundation of everything she had achieved. Free, sincere, and reciprocal relationships. The trip was filled with discoveries, laughter, and moments of genuine connection. Between visits to centuries-old bookstores and charming cafes, Alice realized she was collecting memories that would remain etched not only for herself, but also for those accompanying her. She was living proof that even after storms, it's possible to experience sunny, meaningful days. That last night, sitting in a brightly lit square, Alice was overcome with immense gratitude. She looked at the two beside her and felt that, more than rebuilding her life, she had built a legacy, one that couldn't be measured solely in money or achievements, but in human impact and personal transformation. Back home, she was greeted at the bookstore with a surprise. The community had organized a small party to celebrate the space's 2-year anniversary. There were flowers, music, and a large sign with the words, "Thank you, Alice, for believing in us." Seeing it, she was moved. It wasn't just recognition for what she had done, but for what she had become. As she looked around, Alice realized that the greatest victory wasn't enforcing the codicil, nor removing Richard and Pamela from their inheritance. The true victory was freeing herself from a role that didn't represent her and building, with patience and courage, a life that reflected who she truly was, a life filled with personal choices, respect, and meaning. In that moment, she realized that the story that began with an offensive name tag now ended with a much more powerful title given not by printed paper but by the voice of everyone who knew her. Alice Edwards, the woman who rewrote her destiny. And as she turned out the bookstore lights that night, she knew the next chapter was yet to come, and that she had every blank page to keep writing.